G'day everyone, Dicko here with another live stream. This is live stream number 2 and we are working through creating a room from scratch. This is just a pre-recording because in classic fashion, the audio is screwed up in the live stream. So, with these cubes, I'm going to show you the different ways you can manipulate your 3D objects. So, by default, when you're manipulating stuff in 3D space in Blender, you have what is called global transforms on by default. So with that being on by default, no matter which way I rotate or manipulate these locations and stuff, the axes are always going to be pointing in the X, Y, and Z in the world space. So what the world space represents is basically what you see here is on in your viewport is the that's the global space. So in this case in Blender, it's Y is here, X is here, and Z is going up, right? So what you want to do, if you need to manipulate something in its local space, so what I mean by that, in local space is when you transform an object, say this object, and you want to sort of keep it moving in this direction. So imagine that, you want it to move in this direction. For instance, you want to be able to change that the way that this icon changes. So you might want to have that blue arrow going in the direction of that cube. So the way to do that is pretty simple. So let me just turn off that annotation. To do that, you have to change the way that you transform the pivot point. So in this case, if I want to change it from global, I can switch it to local, for instance. And look what happens to those manipulators. Now, based on the rotation of that object in the transform settings, so if you look at the transforms on the side, it's now got the ability to move in those locked axes in the direction in which that rotation is already happening. You also have a few other options as you get more advanced into like animation and stuff. So let me switch over, for instance, to gimbal mode. So gimbal is a bit more complicated and it has to do with the way that things transform in 3D space. So if I rotated this a little bit too far in this direction, you see how the axes are starting to overlap? This is getting close to what is called gimbal lock. So when the two axes overlap one another, and this is sort of like the true transforms of a 3D object. This is less important when it comes to modeling, but really important when it comes to animation, and it's something to watch out for in the future. The other way you can manipulate objects in 3D space is with the mesh normals. So for instance, when you're manipulating a model in edit mode, I'll just demonstrate. So I'll jump into edit mode. I'll select one of these faces. You can manipulate faces based on their normals. So a normal is basically the direction in which a face is pointing at. So if I were to rotate this face this way, imagine I want to keep moving that face in that direction. So I want to move just this face in this direction. In this direction here. Right now, in gimbal mode, that's not working. In global mode, that's not working. In local mode, you think that might work, but it's not, because it's not actually using the mesh information in local mode. That's more of an object information thing. But if I switch it over to normal, look what happens. Suddenly, I can manipulate that face directly in the direction I want. So if I say, imagine if I wanted to extrude an object here. So imagine if I extruded this object here, or if I want to manipulate just this face in this direction, I can now move it in that direction. I can now move it in this direction, or this direction. And it's all based on the direction or the angle in which that face is sitting. And that makes modeling far, far easier as we get into more complicated models. Because you want to say, imagine if you're doing like a house with a special angle on a wall. Being able to manipulate that wall in the right direction is really important. And that normal orientation works with edges as well. So depending on the edge on the edge direction. So edges also have normals as well. Let's see what they yeah, so just making sure I'm not losing track on the comments because I don't have two screens at the moment. So yeah, but yeah, you can see that all the different ways you can manipulate objects in 3D space. The other thing, again, is one last one, and which is really cool, is the cursor. So imagine if you wanted to pivot around a specific point in 3D space. Using the 3D cursor in Blender, so this little round icon, you can actually pivot an object around that too. So imagine if you wanted to pivot this object to rotate around the center of the world. So we can do that by using the 3D cursor. So let me just reset that 3D cursor to demonstrate. So on a normal per object basis, if I were to rotate this object, it would rotate around the center of the object by default. If I want to pivot around that 3D cursor, I switch over from global to cursor. And look what happens now when I rotate. If I rotate from, oh, sorry. If I were to rotate this cursor here, so imagine if I put the cursor in the object and then rotate that cursor, look what happens when I rotate that cursor. Relative to the cursor, I can manipulate the direction of that object when I move it around or rotate it without really affecting its global or local coordinates as much, which is a really interesting way of doing things. This becomes super important when you're like wanting to rotate an arm in a model or anything like that, or you want to like extrude an arm in a certain direction. Yeah, super good to have. And then you have pivot transforms. So you can transform based on certain selections and certain directions. So if I were to reset these rotations and locations, I can reset it. I'm going to delete this one. I'm going to delete that thing here. All right, so let's reset all these cubes. So I'm just going to reset the rotation of all these. And I'm going to bring down the location back to 0 on those cubes as well. By the way, I'll tell you how to reset transforms in a moment, but basically it's Alt-G, Alt-R, Alt-S. Basically the opposite of scale, rotation, and grab. So if you were to scale with S, and you want to reset that scale, Alt-S will reset that scale. If you've made some transforms or rotations that you're not happy with, and you want to reset those rotations, you push Alt-R on your keyboard, and it will reset. And if you want to reset the location of an object, Alt-G, and it will send it back to the center of the world. So as you can see, the transforms have gone back to 0. All right, so let's see how we can transform an object based on its selection. So in Blender, by default, the default is the median point. So the median point is basically based on your selection. It will transform these series of selected objects based on the average distance between them. So if I were to manipulate like that, it can manipulate those objects based on its selection as an average object. If I were to switch that out to 3D cursor, it will rotate from the 3D cursor point. So it will pivot around that point. Like so. If I wanted to do it by individual groups, so now this is sort of like how Maya operates generally. So if you want to, say I had some rotations on this one, rotations on that one, and I wanted to manipulate the rotations of an object based on their individual origins. So each object has an individual origin. They have their own transforms. If I were to rotate them now, they should rotate on their individual axes. And as you can see, if I lock off on the x-axis, you'll see I'll get these red lines. And they're representing the individual axes of those particular objects. And that becomes super important when you're animating, for instance, like a hand or a fingers, where you want the fingers to rotate on their individual axes. So it's really important once you get used to that. And then finally, we have the active element. So based on your last selection, you can rotate an object, a series of objects around that last selection. The reason I want to talk about this now is basically because as you start modeling, you find yourself switching between these really quite often. And it's really important to understand these things because it gives you more control. All right, so let's just reset the location on those. As you can see, because I haven't locked off the location or applied location, it will go back to 0. Now, if I wanted to sort of fix the location of this object and apply the rotations and scales, like apply all those transforms. So if I had applied some rotations and scales and stuff like that to an object, I can actually fix these transforms so they basically reset to a default value and applies those scales, rotations in that object. So if I want to apply, for instance, the rotation and make this its global transform, I can make it set in stone, I can apply it by pushing Control A and push apply and then rotation. And look what happens. Now that if I go into local view, so before my transforms were local. If I look at my local transforms, look what happens to the axes when I apply the rotation. It resets them into a global orientation. So now this object, even though it's been rotated, is now considered to be at its default rotation. I can no longer go, now if you look at the global and local, they're both the same. Now, look at the difference now if I haven't applied the rotation on this cube. So in local view, you can see X, Y, and Z are now all pointing in the default sort of direction. And now look at the rotation without any applied rotations. It's still working with its local transforms, which is good when you're starting out, but once you're approved, like you're happy with the rotations and scales, you can apply them. And this is really important when you're modeling as well. So when you go from your transforms into edit mode, having your transforms locked and applied will help you model a cleaner model in the end. And I'll explain now with that. So let me just delete all these cubes and demonstrate. I'm going to duplicate this one with the transforms. So once I've done that, so I'm going to scale this one in. For instance, I'm going to scale it in on one axis and really stretch out that cube. I'm going to duplicate that object and I'm going to apply the scale. So watch what happens to the scale once I apply it. It goes to back to 1. So 1 to 1 to 1, whereas the proportions on this one are all fucked up. All right. Now, I'll apply the rotation as well, just for cleanliness sake. So now we have one with some rotations on it, some scale on it, and this one is basically a reset object. So now it's set to 1. Now, if I go into edit mode, I'm going to add a bevel modifier, for instance, to these two objects, and see how how it changes the behavior of the bevel. So, for instance, if I add a bevel modifier to the same object, each object, look how it behaves. So if I make that bigger so it's easier to see, notice how, because the scales haven't been applied to this object here, the bevel is skewing. It's actually not giving you an accurate bevel, whereas this one with the scale applied, the bevel is nice and even. I can add my segments and it will give you a nice smooth transition into those that subdivision. If I add more bevels to this, it's just going to skew. Notice how when I turn on wireframe, the difference. Here it's like perfectly even quads. Here it's all skewed and really uneven. But look what happens when I apply the scale. So I'm going to duplicate that again just to demonstrate. Look what happens when I apply the scale to this object. The bevel evens out. So this becomes really important when it comes to animation and modeling, because when you have transforms on your objects and you're animating or editing them, it's doubling up on those transforms. It's adding those transforms on top of anything you add in your edit or animation. So it's really important to be aware of when you're modeling to make sure that certain things have been applied. So your scales, rotations, and locations, depending on what you're doing. So with that in mind, let's do something cool. Let's try and build like a basic room. So we'll add some walls, we'll add a door, some windows, and maybe some furniture as well. And we'll start with a basic sort of even room, so maybe a square room, and then we can get into some materials as well once we get into that. So to make a new object, we push Shift A, and we're going to add a plane. Oops. Notice how when you create an object, it creates it based on the location of this 3D cursor. Now, so for some people, this can be really annoying, but once you get used to the power of the 3D cursor, it becomes a lifesaver in many ways. So I'm going to reset that 3D cursor back to 0. So in the View tab, reset that to 0. Again, Shift A, and I'm going to create a plane. Notice how in the corner we have this little dialog box. It's minimized at the moment, but when you open it up, it gives you some parameters. Now, notice how the default size of that plane is 2 meters. So 2 meters across and 2 meters down. This is really important once you start modeling for things that meant to be set to real life proportions, because now you know that the grid size, each of these little grids, is about 1 meter. So that means if we want to have a room that's, for instance, 3 meters by 4 meters, I can change that as needed. So for instance, if I go into edit mode and move this edge down here, I know now that this is now a 3 meter by 2 meter room. Now imagine if you want to have this perfectly 2 meters or 3 meters or 4 meters, and you want it snapping across the meters. Blender has snapping tools, and now the cool thing about snapping, you can actually snap it to different things. So in this case, we want to snap it to the grid. So to turn on snapping, we click on this little magnet button. So that turns on snapping, and you get a few options up here as well. So let's have a look at what we have. We have increments, which is basically the grid. We have vertices, edges, faces, volume, and we'll get into that as we get into more detail with this model. But basically you can snap to different things, different mesh objects as well. So vertices, edges, faces, even like the average volume of that object we can snap to. That's really important once you start rigging. If you get into rigging and stuff like that. And then there's more stuff as well. For us, we're going to turn on absolute grid snap. So when we snap to the grid, it will go perfectly to the next grid. So in my case, I'm going to have it maybe a 4 meter by 3 meter room. So now I know that exactly this room, or this floor plan, is going to be exactly 3 meters by 4 meters. Now, if I wanted to make some walls, I'm going to make like a diorama sort of thing. So I'm going to leave out one wall and just have 3 walls open. I can now add walls either by extruding from the floor, or I can have separate objects for the walls themselves. So I might have it as a separate object, but I will start with this plane as the base. So I'm going to extrude out a set of walls. So I'm going to select these 3 faces. So to select multiple faces, you select, shift select, and now I have 3 lines highlighted, 3 edges highlighted, and now I can extrude up. So to extrude up, I can either use the extrude tool, so the extrude region tool, or I can push E on my keyboard. So in my case, I'm just going to push E on my keyboard, and then you'll notice that I can snap up like so. But if I want to lock it in the Z axis, I can push Z on my keyboard, and it will lock it up on the Z as well. So by default, I'm snapping up by 1 meter, 2 meters, and I might snap it up another meter to 3 meters high. And now we have a very simple layout for a room. All right, let's add. Now I want to separate these walls into their own objects. So to separate these 3 walls, I can actually separate it from the mesh. So if we get out of object mode, you'll see that it's still one object. And notice that because we're manipulating the object in edit mode, the transforms are all the same still. They haven't been manipulated. It's only in edit mode that we've been manipulating the mesh. So jump back into edit mode, and we want to separate these 4 or 3 walls. So to do that, we're going to push P on the keyboard for separate, or parent. I'm not sure why it's P on the keyboard, but it just is. And we can go separate by selection. So if we push separate by selection, it will separate those objects. And now I can't manipulate these walls anymore because they're a separate object. I can only manipulate the floor. All right, let's jump into object mode. And now we have a separate wall. And the reason I'm separating this wall is basically so I can add a different material to this object as well. All right, let's give this wall some thickness. So to add some thickness, we're going to go to our modifier tab, and then we can go to the solidify modifier. So solidify modifier is basically a procedural extrusion. So we can have it right now. We have a thickness of 0.1 meter, and this is the nice thing about Blender. It operates in metric, so we know that this thing is 4 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters. So now we know that the wall that we've made right now is 0.01 meters, so around 10 centimeters. So we can actually add thickness to this thing and make it 100 centimeters. And there we have it. Perfect thickness for a wall. Or you can have it like, 0.05 meters, which is around 50 centimeters. And you can actually type in centimeters in Blender as well. So if I were to type in 50 cm, oops, it didn't work. Oh, I thought it would, but I'm wrong. There we go. You can also type in 50 millimeters, sorry. I meant to say millimeters, not centimeters. So there you go, millimeters. So if I type in 50 millimeters, for instance, 50 millimeters, it's the right thickness. If I type in 100 millimeters, so 10 centimeters, and there we go, perfect. All right, I'm gonna bring that back down to 50 millimeters. All right, so now we might want to have some windows. So there's a few ways we can do this. One way is to go into edit mode and create some edge loops, and then we can cut out the faces. We can use booleans. Now booleans are interesting because if I were to make a cube, so you can basically use other shapes. I'm going to turn off snapping now. Other shapes to dictate the sort of cutout of an object. So with that in mind, let me just scale this down, this cube down, to represent a window. So now the window is going to be the size of this cube. So the hole that it cuts out will be this cube. So to add a boolean, we go to the boolean modifier. So we select our wall, go to the boolean modifier, and then right now it's red. So we need to tell this boolean modifier that this cube is going to cut out a hole out of the wall. So to do that, I'm going to click on this little eyedropper, select the cube, and right now you can see it's created some geometry. So notice how now there's a little highlighted hole there, but we can't really see the window. So we need to hide this cube just to show you how that works. So if I hide the cube in the outliner, you can see now that there's a hole. Now this is really good for just basic sort of blocking out, but it's a bit messy because if you were to do more advanced stuff, when you get like, bad n-gons like this, it's not a great idea to have such a broken sort of geometry. A lot of, for a lot of reasons you can get away with it, but let's do something a little bit cleaner. So instead of bullying it, the nice thing about modifiers is that they're non-destructive. So because they're non-destructive, I can just turn this off or get rid of it, and now my wall is back to normal. I can bring back my cube, and I'm just going to delete that cube. So let's model it in this window properly. So to do that, we're going to go into edit mode, and we're going to add some edge loops. So an edge loop is basically quadded edges or edges that get generated based on the quad structure of your objects. So edge loops can only be made with quads, so basically a polygon with 4 edges. To add edge loops, you can either use the loop cut tool. Once you've clicked down on those edge loops, they're now part of the mesh. So now I can edit them like any other part of the mesh. So I can make them bigger, smaller, whatever. If I want to make some extra edge loops, so now I can make edge loops going across the wall. I can do so by clicking Control R again. But instead of clicking up on the top edge, I click on these side edges here. And then I get the same option to cut. Like so. And now I can cut out this I can cut out this window. So to cut out this window, I can click X on my keyboard to delete, and I'm going to choose faces. So if I delete this face, it's cut out the window. And notice that because I have the solidify modifier on, it's automatically filled in those gaps. So it's giving me almost like a windowsill. And because modifiers are non-destructive, I can turn that off and on and see what I'm actually manipulating. So what I'm actually manipulating is just this plane still. And this solidify is just adding that thickness. Now, because I evenly cut those faces, those edges with the edge select tool, I know that this window is exactly 1 meter above the ground, and it's sitting at around 2 meters above the ground at the top. Now, if I want to bring that lower, I could, but let's just keep it as is for now. And now let's add some architraves, or skirting boards. We can add some skirting boards here along the bottom. So to do that, I'm going to do a little trickery. I'm going to click on another edge loop, like so. So I'm just winging it at this point. So I can add a bottom of the floor. And now, instead of separating these first, I'm going to duplicate them. So I'm going to duplicate this skirt at the bottom. So to do that, I'm going to push Shift D to duplicate. And then you might notice that nothing's really happened, but I've actually created a duplicate of that part of the mesh. Now I want to separate that. I'm going to push P again by selection. And now they're separate. And notice how now they've changed color. I can now select the separated mesh. Now, if you find yourself having trouble clicking in Blender, you have there's an order of things based on things that are overlapping. So if you click on an object first, and you want to click on this object, for instance, in the same spot, you can just click again, and you'll get that selection. So in this case, I'm going to select again, and I'll get that that skirt at the bottom. Now, I want to bring that skirt inwards consistently. And this is where our transform stuff comes into play. So in my case, I want to get these scaling inwards at the same rate. So to do that, I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to go to face selection. I'm going to select these faces, right? Like so. And now, remember how I was talking about individual origins? Well, individual origins also works with individual faces in Blender. So I can change the transform object from bounding box center or active element to individual origins. And I'm going to change the translation from global to normal. And I'm going to use the same function as I talked about earlier. So if I move now based on this last selection along the normals, hopefully this will work. Let's see. And if it doesn't work, then we'll just have to do it a different way. But I can scale on the Z, and let's see what happens. No, Y, no, yeah, it's not working. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But that's okay, we could do it a different way. So rather than doing individual origins, let's go with bounding box center or whatever we need. And in this case, I'm just going to push Alt S. So Alt S will inside edit mode will let me scale within with the normals of the object. So you may have noticed that this is scaling a little bit weird over here. So I'm just going to delete these edges here, 1 and 2. I'm going to push X on my keyboard, and I'm going to get this delete operator at the bottom, and I'm going to push delete or dissolve edges. If I push delete edges, look what happens. It deletes the faces as well, which is really weird. We want to dissolve those edges. So let's dissolve them. And now, if I look at the face, it's now a clean face. So using the normal operator, I can either scale along the normals. So by doing that, I can push Alt S on the keyboard in edit mode to scale along the normals. And notice how it's now scaling consistently across every object here. The reason why we need to scale across the normals, because if we scale normally just by holding S, it actually shrinks the selection. We just want to shrink the direction in which they are. So Alt S will scale across this selection, like so. And now we have our skirting boards. How's the stream going? Is it all good now? It's still going all right? I'm not sure. Another thumbs up or another mention would be good to know. Hopefully it is. Yep, sweet. All right, cool. Now you may have remembered, if you were here from last week, you may remember I forgot a certain feature in Blender with how to make like a bowl just by using edges. We're going to do that with a table now. So we're going to add a circular table to this room just by using modifiers and a few edges. So let's make a new collection. So in this collection, I'm going to call this collection floor and walls. So floor and walls. And I'm going to open up this tab and turn on all my filter settings. I'm going to turn that on. And then I'm going to collapse this floor and walls and just turn off disable selection. So I can't select these objects anymore, but I can make new objects in a new collection. So I'm going to make a new collection and I'm going to call it furniture. Now, if I have this collection selected, any object that I create now will be created in this furniture tab. So let's add let's fix up that 3D cursor again. All right, cool. And I'm going to add a single vert. So in this case, if you don't have this option, actually, let's just go with this in case you don't have this option, because I have a few plugins turned on. Let's go to plane. We're going to add a new plane. And then we're going to go straight into edit mode. And we're going to collapse this selection. So we're going to merge all these vertices into a single vertice. So to do that, I'm going to push Alt M and push merge at center. So you may see that you think there's nothing there. There's actually a single vertice there to play with. And with this one little vertice, we're going to create an entire table. So to do that, I'm going to go into my orthographic view. So you can go to orthographic view by going to the tilde button and pushing front. And you get the orthographic view. I'm going to hide my walls for now. And I'm going to do that by unchecking this little button here. Turn that off. So now I just have my little vert visible. And now I'm going to create a silhouette of basically the table outline that I want to make. So to do that, I'm going to be in edit mode, as you can see here. And now I'm going to extrude out another vertex to the side. And I'm going to lock it in on the x-axis as I do it. So I'm going to push E on the keyboard and then X. So notice how I get a highlighted x-axis, and then I'm going to extrude out another vertex, like so. I'm then going to extrude out another one on the Z. So Z. So make sure you have global turned on in this case. So I'm going to extrude in the Z. And then I'm going to extrude again on the X, but in the other direction. Now you may not see it, but I'm actually creating a line of edges to play with. So I'm going to make any old pattern I like. So basically I'm going to create the pattern of a table, just half of a table. up, and extrude out again, X, extrude up, X, Z, X. Now look what happens once I add this modifier. So, and I'm going to put this last vertice exactly in 0. So I can actually transform vertices directly using the item tab. I'm going to go to vertex, this selected vertex, and push 0. And now if I jump out into object mode, you'll see that I have this sort of layout of a table. Now make sure that your transforms are set to 0. So, and your object is set exactly in the 0 space. So you can do that by Alt-A, apply location scale, or all transforms. And now we're going to add a modifier. Now watch what happens with this, it's magic. Add modifier, I'm going to add a screw modifier. And boom, I have myself a table. I could actually make half a table if I wanted to by changing the angle. So you can actually make a half table if you wanted to. You can make a full table by setting it to 360. Oops, not 36, 360. Or you can do whatever amount you like. I'm gonna tab back out now. Now I can bring back my floor and walls. And you can see I have a table. How cool is that? Yeah, so modifiers are amazing and it saves you so much time. And the cool thing about modifiers is now I can manipulate the shape of this table in all kinds of ways just by tabbing back into edit mode, turning off the screw modifier, and then I can add extra detail. So if I wanted to add extra height to this table, I just go into edit mode, select these verts, bring up this table so I have a longer sort of sitting point. So I know that this window, for instance, is sitting on about 1 meter high. So I might make this table 1 meter high. And then I'll grab these edges here, and then I'll make that lip even wider. And then I'll box select. So to box select, you push B on the keyboard, or you can just drag and select, and I'll make that thicker. And now I'll jump back into out of edit mode, and you can see my table is pretty big, and I could change the angle of that bottom of the table to make it even thicker at the bottom, and you can have a bit of a lip at the bottom and bring it out like so. Turn on that modifier again, and now I have sort of like a cafe style table. And then I can sharpen up these edges by adding, well, first I could sharpen up those edges with the bevel modifier. So I can push a bevel, add a bevel to that thing. You may notice it's gone a bit funny because of the nature of the modifier here. So I need to merge vertices on this screw modifier. So it will merge those, on that last rotation, it will merge vertices that have been generated. And then you can see now that the bevel works, it's actually beveling every edge that I've made. But I don't want that. I want to only bevel the edges of the table. So to do that, I can change the way that the bevel modifier works. In this case, I want to change it to the limit method to angle. So based on the angle of the edges being generated, it will create the bevel. And then I can add extra subdivisions by pushing segments. And now I have a nice softer looking table. Now I may want to smooth this out now so it's not so polygonal. So I want to have a perfectly round table. So I can do that by adding a subdivision surface. By subdividing, you're effectively doubling up the vertices, and then it's averaging out the distance and smoothing out those vertices. So now I have a nice smooth table. Let me turn off wireframe preview, and you can see it's pretty smooth. It's still a bit polygonal, but it's much better than it was before. The only thing is that this can be a bit of a trap. So the more subdivisions you add to an object, the more calculations that's required to generate that object. So if you start animating objects with lots of subdivisions, your scene will slow down significantly as you work on it. I can add one more subdivision in the viewport, and you can see it's nice and smooth. I've got a question here asking where the single vert is. If you don't have that option, you could actually install the add-on from the Preferences tab to get that in. Otherwise, you can collapse a vert by merging it with Control Alt M. But if you want to turn on the extra features, you can go to Preferences and look up the add-on Mesh, and you'll see an object for object. So add mesh. Where is it? No. Extra objects. It's called extra objects. So add mesh extra objects. So if you turn that on, you'll get the objects options for extra stuff like the single vert, round cube, math functions, all that sort of stuff. But if you can't get that working, you can always make it your own single vert by collapsing an object. So I'll do that again just to show you what I mean. So I'm just gonna create a any old object. So imagine I have this object here. I go into edit mode. I push Alt M with all these verts selected, push merge to center, and now I have a single vert to play with, and I can extrude out edges like so. All right, now let's add a basic sort of chair. So we can add a really simple sort of chair to this restaurant scene, and we'll work through this. We'll work through this scene over the next couple of weeks to really bring out some detail. We'll go a bit over time today because of that technical hiccup, but let's add some materials to this as well. So we'll do some quick material editing as well. So materials are needed for rendering out this image. All right, so let's make a quick chair. All right, cool. So let's make a quick chair. Let's make reset the cursor. Now this chair may be not as fancy as the Andrew Price chair from his tutorials recently, but it's the same idea basically without the reference though. So in this case, we're going to go with a cube, a simple cube. And now let's just go straight into edit mode and manipulate this cube. So I'm going to bring down the width of this thing by selecting faces. And I'm going to get it into a general kind of chair setting. So I'm going to get the proportions relatively right. All right, cool. All right, so this will be the seat of the chair, and I'm gonna just edit that and sort of put it where I think it should sit, relatively speaking. All right, cool. Now I'm gonna use some modifiers to bend the seat a little bit so it sort of sits like a little bit of a bendy chair. So to do that first, I need to add some subdivisions to this object first. So to add some extra subdivisions, I'm gonna push W on my keyboard. Or in your case, you might have to just right click and get the menu and then push subdivide. And what that will do is add a few edge loops to that object. I'm going to add a few more manually with the loop cut tool. So I'm going to add a few more, Control R there, Control R here, Control R here, just 2 on each one. So I have a kind of nice distribution of quads. And notice how the object origin now, because I've been editing it, is a bit off whack. So it's not actually in the center of this object. And I need to bring that origin point up to this seat. So to do that, I'm going to push W or right click on my keyboard. I'm going to go to set origin and then origin to geometry. So now the origin is set to the center of that object. I'm going to go to add modifier and I'm going to go to simple deform. So simple deform, click that object, and you can see I'm getting some cool little twisty effects here. But in this case, I just want to use bend. I'm going to set the axis to Z. So I can get, or maybe X or Y. Let's just see how we can get the bend, how we want it. And then we can change the angle to get it to a certain level. In this case, I might go with Z, just to get a bit of a bend. Sort of like that. See how the X works as well. X doesn't work too well, so I'm just going to go with X. You can also use other objects to manipulate the bend as well. So in this case, I might do that. So I'm going to bring the 3D cursor up to this point, and I'm going to push Shift S, cursor to selected. and then I'm going to create an empty, like a controller for this thing. So for that, I'm going to push Shift A, and I'm going to create an empty. In this case, I'm going to just choose some plain axis. So just a plain axis object like that. And then I use this axis to control the bend of our geometry there. So to do that, I'm going to go to axis origin. I'm going to select this little eyedropper, and I'm going to bring it over to this empty. Select that. And then if I switch the bend, you'll notice that I have a few options now when I control it. I can control the bend by manipulating the empty. Let's see if this works with a different setup. This doesn't work. You can try twisting it, bending it, stretching it. Let's just try rotating this thing. See what happens when we bend it. That's what I want. So I want the bend to sit upwards. So in this case, I'm going to have to rotate this empty 90 degrees along the X. And look what happens. It's now bending in the direction I want. So that's kind of what I want. And then I can increase the stretch of that bend. I can increase the angle of that bend by using that. So let's go with something like this. And then I'm just going to push apply. In this case, I'm going to make it destructible. So I'm going to apply the bend. So once I apply it, it's now fixed in the mesh, and now I can edit the mesh as I need to. I can now delete this empty. And now I might want to bring the rotation of this seat back around. So I'm going to rotate this seat 90 degrees towards the X. So in this case, I have to go rotate, push R. If you want to lock it to a certain axis, in this case, because it's set to global, I'm going to push Z on the keyboard, and then I'm going to type in 90 degrees. And then push enter, and then I have a perfect rotation at exactly 90 degrees. All right, so let's create some legs. So in this case, I'm just going to make another cube. I'm going to, again, in this case, I'm just going to scale it down straight in edit mode and add some legs. I'm going to just manipulate the scale, rotation as needed. So in this case, I'm just going to create some legs. I'm going to bring it to sort of in that point of where I need to on one leg, like so. I'm going to scale this down. In edit mode, I'm just going to bring that down to the ground. And now I need to apply those transforms. So in this case, I'm just going to apply the scale because I'm going to do some trickery with the transforms here. So let's apply the scale. And now I want to transform this using modifiers to add the extra legs. So I want to transform it relative to this 3D cursor. So I'm going to switch the origin point of this object to the 3D cursor. So to do that, right click on the object, go to W, in my case. I'm going to go set origin to 3D cursor. And now the origin is now going to be rotating around that 3D cursor. But this is really important when we're going to use modifiers. So I'm going to go to add modifier. I'm going to add a mirror modifier. And as you can see, it's basically mirroring exactly across the center point of that chair seat. And then I'm going to mirror modifier again by adding a Y. And now I have my 4 legs. And now in edit mode, I can still edit these legs. So in this case, I might taper the legs at the bottom to get something like that. I might splay it out like so. And now I have a nice stool to play with at the moment. And now we can keep working with that. Now we just need to make the back of the chair. So in this case, I might just duplicate this object. I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to rotate it like so. I might squish down that. In this case, I might go into edit mode and select these faces to make it a little bit thinner at the back. So select these faces. You can also box select the faces. I'm going to just go into my normal selection mode. I'm going to go to individual origins and give that a go again. And now if I select that face, let's select that face. Let's see what happens. There we go. That should be working. Yep. We can also go to normal. Let's see if that works there. Nah. Yeah, that'll do. So I'm just going to bring it in. I'm going to delete this edge loop in the middle. So to select the whole edge loop and delete it, Alt right click, or Alt click in your case, and then push X on the keyboard, dissolve those edges, and then I can remove that edge loop. And then again, I'm just going to scale those in a little bit. And then I'm just going to scale those down like so. So I have a bit of a thinner seat back. And then let's just bring that back down to around that point. I'm going to squish it based on the rotation. So I'm going to go to local view, and then I'm going to rotate it in the Y. You can see it's rotation in the Y, just to thin it down. And now we have our backing. Now, how are we going to get the back of the seats to align perfectly with this object here? So here's a nice little trick. I'm going to create a cube. I'm going to scale that down. I'm going to scale it right down just a little bit. And then I'm going to push Control A to apply the scale. And now I'm going to match the rotation of this object to this object here. So to do that, we have to first, we can do it in a few ways, but in this way, I might do it with a constraint. It might be a little bit easier. So in this case, I'm going to add a constraint to this object and then apply it. So if I select on this object here, I'm going to add a constraint. So a constraint basically copies parameters from another object. So I'm going to object constraint. I'm going to add a copy copy transforms, and as you can see, it's red at the moment. But if I go to this eye picker and push here, it perfectly aligns to that object. And as you can see, because this thing has scale attributes on it, it's actually copying the scale, so it's squishing down that cube. But if we push apply scale on that backing of the seat, you can see it's now, the cube is now gone back to normal. But we can now apply that rotation by, I guess we have to apply it through a, we have to apply it through baking in a keyframe. So I'm just going to push I on the keyboard, lock, and I'm just going to just add a keyframe. In your case, it might just pop up like so. So it's gone yellow, and then I'm just going to push object. I'm going to go to bake animation. This is probably a long way. It's probably an easier way to do this, but I'm just going to go bake action. I'm going to say clear constraints. I'm just going to choose start frame 1, end frame 1, and then only selected objects. So visual keying, turn that on. Clear parents, turn that on, and then apply. As you can see now, all those rotations have been applied. The constraint is gone, and now that rotation is now perfectly aligned. And now I can delete these keyframes. So to do that, right click on the transforms, clear keyframes, clear keyframes, clear keyframes. And now you can see that's perfectly aligned. Now if we go into edit mode or in object mode, I can now move it in local mode. So if we go to local mode, you can see it's now moving perfectly in local X and Y. So it's perfectly aligned to that chair. So now that that's been set up, we can apply the rotations to this. So Control A rotations. And now in edit mode, we can shrink down that cube a little bit further. And now we can now just extend it using the normal transform. So switch it over to normals. And now I can perfectly bring it down like so. Bring it in like that. So it sort of sits in that chair. And then we can just manipulate in normal mode where those tapering goes. And you can do something like that. Or we can play with the scale at the bottom. Like so. It's up to you. but I'm just going to keep it like that for now. And now I need to mirror that across. So again, I'm going to go to this chair, cursor to selected, and then I'm going to go to this object, push W on the keyboard, set origin to 3D cursor. I'm going to add a mirror modifier. So in this case, where are we? I'm in the wrong section. Go to the mirror modifier. And as you can see, it's mirroring across the wrong axis at the moment because we have it's set to X, but if we switch it to Y, that's good. And then we can turn off X. And now we have the backing of our chair. All right, cool. So let's give this some color. So I'm going to apply all these modifiers now. So I'm going to apply it. So I'm going to make it destructive. So I'm going to, so I won't be able to use this mirror modifier anymore. So just apply it. I'm going to apply this one as well. And then I'm going to join all these objects as a single mesh. So I'm going to apply the scale and rotation on this one as well. Scale, rotation. And now I want to have this all a single object as a single mesh. So you can actually join mesh objects together to be one object. So to do that, I'm going to go to select everything. So shift select the back, the seat, the top, and the legs. And then I push Control J on the keyboard and it joins it all as a single mesh. So now it's a single object. And if I look at it in edit mode, I can still manipulate those objects in edit mode, but now it's just a single piece of geometry. All right. And then we can add other stuff to it. So we could do like we did before, we can add a bevel. We can add some bevels. We can subdivide that. And we have a pretty nice simple chair to go with. And then we can add, we can sharpen up those bevels a little bit by changing the offset. So we can slowly change the offset. You have to hold down shift maybe. So in this case, 0.6 meters is pretty good for that. I can add an extra segment. I can soften up those bevels a little bit. There we go. And again, I'll change it to angle. And now I have a nice little, soft little chair to play with. All right, before we wrap up for today, let's add some materials to this thing. I'm going to save this file just on the desktop for now. Always make sure to back up your files as well. So I'm going to add some color to this wall, to this chair and this table, just with some basic materials. So let's just pop into our viewport shading preview mode. And as you can see, everything's kind of white at the moment. So we need to add some materials. So to add some materials, we click on an object and we go to the material tab. We push new, so it's going to add a new material slot and it's going to add a new material. And you can rename this material with anything you like. In this case, because I selected the table, I'm going to give it the material table. And then you have all these options to change the color. Change the parameters. You can make it metallic. You can make it rougher or smoother, like glossy or not. But in this case, let's just change the color for today and change it to maybe a red color. So I'm going to have a red table. I'm going to make this chair blue. So I'm going to add a new material. And rename this as a chair. I'm going to give this a material that's blue. I'm going to make the walls yellow just to make it clear to understand. And as you can see, because I've had the selection turned off, I can't select the object anymore. Let's go to object mode and then select disable selection. We're going to turn that back on so it's white, and now I can select that wall again. I'm going to add a new material. I'm going to call this wall. I'm going to give it a yellow wall. And then I'm just going to give each material a different color for now. And then next week we can play with all the different parameters. We can add a few more pieces to this room and we'll get this lit up and looking really nice. So we're going to add some colors to this skirts. So add the color. We're going to select the material on this one. We're going to call it skirts. I'm going to change this to, I don't know, purple. And then the floor, I might just give it another ugly color, like a green to make everything look weird. Floor. And then I'm going to add one more color. And There we go. So now we actually have it all ready to render, really. If we wanted to render this out, we could. So if we went to render preview, everything is dark because we haven't got any lights in this room. But if we added a light, so first thing, let's just change the world to black. So this actually, the gray actually gives light information. So in this background, in the world settings, this gray color actually gives the world some color. So we can actually bring that back to black, and you can see nothing is visible. But if we add a light, so back in edit into our regular viewport mode, if we add a light, Control Shift A, and add a just a point light. So in this case, I'm going to add a point light to the middle of the room, and I go back to my render preview mode in viewport shading. You can see it's actually lighting up the room. And if we go to our light settings, we can actually make the light more powerful. Right now it's only 10 watts. If we give it like 100 watts, it's lighting up that room. Not a great render right now, but it's a start, and you can play with all kinds of stuff like that as well. But that will be it for today. We'll continue working on this room as we go through the weeks. We may even add a little, we're going to add some extra furniture. We're going to add some windows like glass. We're going to add a tree in the background. We'll add a roof, and we'll get this looking really, really cool. So every week we'll work on this room to get it up to scratch and look really, really cool. But for today, I think that will be it. So I think, yeah, if you're happy to end it with that, I'll say goodbye. And if you followed this tutorial or this walkthrough, save your file and keep it for next week, because that way we can work on it together, and we'll keep adding it more and more to this thing. We may even get to the point where we added like a simple little cartoon character. We never know. But every week we'll add new stuff. We'll get into texturing, we'll get into lighting, and we'll add new modifiers, everything you need to make this thing look really, really cool. So until then, I'll see you next week, and catch us.